Well, today is Red Dress Day to honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. The University of Manitoba held an event in the lead up to the occasion. The crowd was addressed by Cambria Harris, whose mother was killed in Winnipeg about 2 years ago.
I want to be able to provide that transparency to not only my community, but to members of the public, to give people an idea on what this kind of situation is like when you have to live through it, because some people will never, ever, ever have to step in those shoes, but I think it's important to acknowledge it.
Harris said while her mom, Morgan Harris, struggled with mental illness and addiction, she was also a loving and fierce mother. Harris told the crowd about the struggles her mother faced as a vulnerable First Nations woman. The man accused of killing Harris's mother and 3 other women is about to go to trial. A jury is scheduled to start hearing evidence in Jeremy Sebecki's trial next week. He pleaded not guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. Well, for more on Red Dress Day, we are joined by Cora McGuire-Cyrette. She is the CEO of Ontario Native Women's Association. She's in Thunder Bay, Ontario today. Cora, thank you for taking the time.
I'm happy to have the conversation.
I wanted to start by asking you about this day specifically. What for you does today mean?
You know, today I, like many Indigenous women, unfortunately, are survivors of violence and are family members of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so today is a reminder that it's not safe to be an Indigenous woman here in Canada. But today is also a reminder that there is many solutions out there, many recommendations that need to be acted upon immediately. And so that's what today really is about, is if we really want to honor those who are no longer with us, we need to do something about it. We need to make sure that these tragedies stop and that the violence stops today. That's really what today is about for us as survivors and families.
Because in 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls came up with 231 recommendations, not a small number, in order to address this issue of violence against Indigenous girls and women and Two-Spirit people. How much, from your perspective, progress have we made since then?
I guess it depends on, for progress, it depends on who exactly is doing the progress. So I'm seeing progress happening in communities, community-based action led by Indigenous women in communities. So if we're looking at progress from that perspective, there's progress happening in Timmins, in Ottawa through the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition. They've actually built safety committees in these communities to look at what they can do. And these are unfunded pieces of work that's happening in communities, community collaboration. But when you're looking at from across jurisdictions, more work needs to happen. And so when you're looking at the recent budget that was just, the federal budget that was announced, there's very little funding towards prevention of this crisis. When you're looking at, the funding for the Red Dress Alert, which is a good initiative. But, we as an organization are looking at where's those upstream investments? Where's the investments into Indigenous women's healing, into Indigenous women's education, into Indigenous women's work? There's no, one of the recommendations from the National Inquiry was the need for core sustainable funding for Indigenous women's organizations to be able to do this work, to do the prevention-based work, to do community-based action, which is where the action will take place. And so we're not seeing any of those investments. And that's part of the change that we need to, us as Canadians, call up our elected officials and ask them, say, where's the investment into Indigenous women?
As you mentioned, there is some things that are happening. As you mentioned, the Red Dress Alert System, it is being discussed in Manitoba, but there's no implementation date of when that would be available and ready to go. What do you think needs to be done now?
I think we need to look at the whole situation, because this is, a systemic crisis and a systemic issue here in Canada. And that, when we're only investing in, into systems for when we go missing or into commemorative projects after we've been murdered, but not really investing into us when we're for our safety. At a core root, that's what we're talking about here, is that Indigenous men's safety in communities. And that's what needs to happen, is that we need to have investments into all of those systems, into all those places to be able to tackle it. And it needs to begin based on what Indigenous women's recommendations have been, because they're the experts on this issue. Mm-hmm. And there's so many recommendations out there that haven't been acted upon. You've got the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you've got the National Inquiry, even ONWA, we've written our own report, Reconciliation with Indigenous Women's Report, that was engaged, we engaged with over 5,000 Indigenous women over 50 years to ask them what needed to be done for safety. So the pathway is there. We just need to start as, Canadians and as a community, pick one recommendation and create a plan and start working on it.
Why, from your perspective, do you think it's taking so long?
Well, because it's systemic, and a lot of people don't like change. They don't want change. When you have privilege on the backs of Indigenous women and children, it may be a difficult conversation. In Canada, people are learning about this crisis probably mostly through media, not through the education system. The education system, isn't really talking about Canada's truthful history and the targeting of us as Indigenous women here in Canada and the targeting of our leadership. And so that Canada has been based on Indigenous values. And so all of these pieces here are not being talked about or discussed unless we're in the media. And this is where people are learning about it sometimes for the first time. And so I think, that's something that we need to change here in Canada. We need to change the curriculum. We need to change the story. And it's because, and our grandchildren's grandchildren deserve that.
How should Canadians be marking Red Dress Day? What are you doing? What would you recommend others do?
I think, there's such a huge opportunity that we can't do this work alone. We need allies. We need the support of the community. And that's really what the call is today, is that, be able to look at some of the reports, go to our the ONWA website and look at our Reconciliation with Indigenous Women's report and read the report. Even the act of reading that report and educating yourself on it is an act to address this crisis that we're in right now. Look at the recommendations and, pick up one of the recommendations, and look at it within your workplace or if you're volunteering, pick one recommendation, look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. There's so many reports. And so, be able to read the reports and realize that this work here is for all of us in Canada. And, there's an opportunity here for all of us to be part of the solution. And just remembering, the work begins and must begin and end with Indigenous women as a starting basis. And so we'd really love to have that, respectfully call to action to each and every person you're watching today to pick up a report and look at what can they do to support one of the recommendations.
Cora, thank you so much.
Well, maybe